You married way down, sweetheart. She said it with a smile. That was the worst part, the smile. I set my glass down on the white tablecloth and said nothing. Around me, the room kept moving. Champagne, laughter, the clink of crystal. No one looked at me. No one ever really did, but 10 minutes later, a man walked through that door, silver-haired, chest full of ribbons, 4 stars on his shoulder, and he didn't shake hands with the host. He didn't stop for the champagne. He walked straight to me, took my hand, and kissed it. Before we dive in, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop your country and your local time in the comments right now. It always means something to know who's out there. Now, let me take you back to where this really started. A few hours earlier, I almost didn't go. I was sitting on the edge of our bed in the house Daniel and I had shared for 11 years, holding one earring and staring at the carpet. The other earring was on the nightstand. I hadn't put it on yet. I'd been sitting there for maybe 20 minutes. Daniel knocked on the doorframe. He does that, knocks even when the door's already open. It's one of the things I loved about him from the beginning. He said, "You almost ready?" And I said, "Almost." And he smiled that quiet smile of his and went back down the hall. I put the earring on. Here's what I didn't tell him. I'd spent the better part of that afternoon trying to talk myself out of going. Not because I was sick, not because I was tired, though at 48 I am always some shade of tired. I didn't want to go because I knew what the evening would feel like. I'd been to enough of these things to know. The Caldwell family gatherings had a rhythm to them, and my place in that rhythm had been decided long before I ever walked through their front door. I was the wrong choice. That was the family position on me, and it had never really changed. Daniel's younger brother Marcus was proposing to a girl named Claire that night. A formal engagement party at the family estate in McLean, Virginia. Claire was everything the Caldwells understood. Old money, good schools, a last name that opened doors. She was lovely, genuinely, and I had nothing against her, but I knew what her arrival meant for me. It meant the family would have a new standard to hold up against the woman their eldest son had chosen. And that standard would be used like a lamp, turned on me so everyone could see what was missing. I am not someone who grew up worrying about rooms like that. My mother was a practical woman from outside of Knoxville, Tennessee. She cooked pinto beans on Sundays, kept her floors clean, and taught me that you earned your place by what you did, not by what you wore or what your grandmother's maiden name was. I carried that with me for 26 years in uniform. It served me well in places where no one cared about your table manners, but everyone cared whether you kept your head straight under fire. But rooms like the Caldwell house, rooms with oil paintings and caterers and crystal that costs more than some people's monthly rent, those rooms have their own gravity. And for 11 years, I had felt that gravity trying to pull me down to a size I refused to be. I looked at myself in the mirror before I left. Dark green dress, the one Daniel said made my eyes look serious. Low heels. I'd worn higher, but heels that high in a room like that feel like a statement. And I'd decided a long time ago I wasn't interested in making statements. Statements drew attention. Attention led to questions. Questions led to places I wasn't ready to go. Works for the government. That was always my answer. Logistics, I'd say if they pushed. Federal contractor work, I'd say if they pushed harder. It wasn't a lie exactly. It was just a version of the truth trimmed down to a size that fit in polite conversation without breaking anything. Daniel knew more than most. He knew I'd served. He knew there had been deployments, that I had come back from the second one quieter than I'd left, that I kept a photograph in the top drawer of my nightstand that I had never shown him. He was wise enough not to ask, or maybe he loved me enough not to need to. I was never sure which. What he didn't know, what almost nobody knew, was the weight of what those years had actually cost. Not the physical cost, though there was that too. The other kind. The kind that sits in your chest at 2 in the morning when the house is quiet and you can still hear the rotor noise if you let yourself. The kind that has a number attached to it, 6. 6 crews who didn't come home on a night I had flown 3 times and lived. I don't talk about that. I hadn't talked about it in years. I came downstairs, and Daniel was waiting by the front door with his jacket on, holding mine. He helped me into it, kissed my cheek, and said, "You look beautiful." He meant it. He always meant it. That's the thing about Daniel Caldwell that his family never quite understood. He was genuinely good. Not good for them. Just good. We drove out to McLean in the early October dark, the kind of evening where the air smells like dry leaves, and something is changing even if you can't name it exactly. The highway lights made slow orange streaks across the windshield. Daniel had the radio on low, something country, and he sang along to half the words the way he always did when he thought I wasn't listening. I was listening. I was always listening. I watched the road and I thought about nothing in particular, which is what I have trained myself to do when I'm driving towards something I would rather avoid. You clear the channel. You fly the approach. You don't think about the landing until you have to. Older Americans understand this, I think. After enough years, you develop a kind of internal quiet that isn't the same as peace, but functions like it in a pinch. You've been to enough difficult rooms. You've sat across from enough people who looked at you and saw something lesser. You've learned to breathe through it and keep your face still. We pulled through the gate at 7:30. The house was lit up the way it always was for these things. Every window, string lights across the garden, valets in black vests taking keys. I watched a woman in a fur stole step out of a car ahead of us and laugh at something her husband said. Her laugh carried all the way to where we were sitting. That kind of laugh. The kind that assumes the whole world wants to hear it. Daniel squeezed my hand before we got out. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. I stepped out onto the gravel drive, smoothed my dress, and walked toward the front door. And somewhere behind us, not yet visible, a black government sedan was pulling off the beltway. The Caldwell house in McLean was the kind of place that made you feel underdressed the moment you stepped inside, even if you weren't. Marble foyer, a chandelier that probably had its own insurance policy, fresh flowers on every surface, white roses, which Diane Caldwell favored because she'd read somewhere that white roses meant class, and Diane was nothing, if not deliberate, about the signals she sent. A string quartet was set up near the staircase, playing something I recognized but couldn't name, the kind of music chosen to suggest that the people in the room had always lived this way and found it perfectly natural. A woman in a white catering uniform took my coat. Daniel's hand found the small of my back as we moved into the main room, and I was grateful for it. Not because I needed steadying, but because it reminded me I wasn't alone in the room, even when I felt like I was. The party was already full, 60, maybe 70 people, the kind of crowd that moves in clusters and talks loudly enough to signal confidence. I recognized faces from previous Caldwell events. The cousin, who worked in finance and always wanted to discuss his portfolio, the aunt who asked me every single time what Daniel saw in me as though the question were affectionate, the family friends who had known Daniel since prep school and looked at me the way you look at a piece of furniture that doesn't quite go with the room. Marcus and Claire were near the fireplace, receiving congratulations. They looked happy genuinely, the easy happiness of two people who had chosen each other and hadn't yet been tested by anything serious. I wished them well. I wished them the kind of years that don't ask too much of you. And then I saw Diane. She was standing with a group of women her age near the bar, holding a champagne flute with both hands the way she always did, like a prop, like something to gesture with. She was wearing a deep blue dress and pearls. She always wore pearls. She saw us come in and her expression did what it always did. A brief recalibration, a smile that moved her mouth but not the rest of her face. And then she was moving toward us with her arms slightly open. She kissed Daniel's cheek first. "Sweetheart, you look wonderful." Then she turned to me. "Heidi? One word, the way you name a piece of furniture. That dress is practical." "Thank you," I said. Daniel's hand pressed a little harder against my back. "Are you still doing the government work?" she asked, loud enough for the two women behind her to hear. "I am," I said. She tilted her head, that small, patient smile never wavering. I suppose someone has to. The two women behind her laughed softly, not at anything specific, just to agree. I have stood in the rotor wash of a Black Hawk at 3 a.m. with a man bleeding out on a stretcher in front of me and made decisions in seconds that I would have to live with for the rest of my life. Diane Caldwell was not a difficult room, but she was a persistent one. We were released after a few more minutes of pleasantries that were neither pleasant nor particularly civil, and Daniel steered us toward the drinks table. He said, quietly, "I'm sorry." He said that a lot at these events. I never told him to stop. "I'm fine," I said, and I was. I've always been good at fine. The evening moved the way these evenings do. I ate a small plate of things I didn't really taste. I spoke to Marcus and Claire and meant the congratulations I offered them. I talked to a retired judge who had interesting things to say about water rights in the Shenandoah Valley, which I found genuinely interesting, and I think he found my interest surprising, which itself told me something about what people expected from me in that room. Deanne circled back twice. The second time, she brought a friend. A woman named Patrice who had the kind of highlighted hair and very straight posture that signals a certain kind of Virginia money. Patrice asked me what I did, and Diane answered for me before I could open my mouth. "Heidi works for the government, Patrice. Logistics." A small pause. "She's very dedicated to it." The pause did all the work the words didn't. Patrice nodded with the polite blankness of someone who had already filed me and moved on. I looked at the white roses on the mantel behind them. They were starting to open, petals loosening in the warm room. There's a window with roses when they're perfect. Tight enough to last, open enough to be beautiful. After that, they start to drop. I've always found something true in that. Across the room, Daniel was talking to Marcus's college friends. He laughed at something one of them said, and his whole face changed when he laughed, went younger, easier. I loved that about him. I watched him for a moment and remembered, not for the first time, why I had said yes. It was near 8 o'clock when I noticed the old man. He was standing near the entrance to the side hall, holding a glass of water, not champagne. Tall, even now, with the kind of posture you don't maintain into your late 70s without having had it enforced for decades. Silver hair, close cut, dark suit, no name tag. Because men like him don't need name tags at parties. Their presence is itself an introduction. He wasn't talking to anyone. He was watching the room the way certain people watch rooms, not socially, not looking for a conversation, but reading it the way you read terrain. Old habit. I knew it because I had it too. His eyes moved across the party slowly. They passed over the fireplace, the bar, the string quartet. They moved in my direction, and then they stopped. He looked at me for a moment that was slightly too long to be casual. Something shifted in his face. Not recognition exactly, not yet, but the beginning of it. Like a word on the tip of the tongue. Like a name you know. I looked away first. Deanne appeared at my elbow again with a fresh champagne flute and a smile like a paper cut. "You know," she said. Just loud enough. "Marcus's Claire went to Georgetown." "Did you ever finish your degree, Heidi?" "I finished 3 degrees, I didn't say that." I never say that. I just smiled at Diane the way you smile at weather, acknowledging it without expecting it to change, and told her I'd done some coursework along the way. She nodded with the satisfaction of someone who had just confirmed a suspicion. Patrice made a soft sound of sympathy, the kind of sound that isn't really sympathy at all. Daniel was still across the room. He hadn't heard. I was glad. He would have said something, and saying something would have made it worse in the long run, because Diane never forgave being corrected publicly, and I had long since decided that the cost of winning a moment wasn't worth the weeks of frost that followed. That's a calculation older women know how to make. You've been in enough rooms, with enough people who use niceness as a delivery system for harm, and you learn to think in longer time horizons. Let it go tonight. Choose the hill that's worth dying on. Not every condescension requires a response. Some of them just require endurance, which is something I had in considerable supply. I excused myself and moved toward the garden doors. The night air outside was cold and clean and smelled like boxwood and grass, and I stood on the stone terrace for a few minutes and breathed it in. There was a fountain at the center of the garden, lit from below, water moving slow and steady. I watched it. There is something about moving water that has always helped me think. In Kandahar, there had been an irrigation ditch behind the forward operating base that ran all night. And sometimes at 2 or 3 in the morning, I would stand near it and let the sound fill up the space where the other sounds lived. I wasn't thinking about Kandahar now. I was thinking about whether I could get through the next 2 hours without anything breaking. The garden door opened behind me. I expected Daniel. It wasn't Daniel. It was the old man. He stepped out onto the terrace and stood a few feet away, not close enough to intrude, far enough to be polite. He looked at the fountain. I looked at the fountain. We stood like that for a moment, 2 people pretending to be alone together. "Cold night," he said finally. "I don't mind cold," I said. He nodded. He had the voice I expected, low, unhurried, the voice of someone who had spent decades being listened to and no longer needed volume to accomplish it. "These parties," he said, more to himself than to me, "get louder every year. Or maybe I just get older." I almost smiled at that. "Probably both," I said. He turned to look at me then. Direct. No pretense of looking away. People who have spent their lives in command tend to look at you like that, straight and steady, like they're reading something printed on your face. I've been looked at that way by a lot of people. I've looked at people that way myself. "You're not what I expected to find here tonight," he said. I held his gaze. I get that a lot in this house. Something moved in his eyes, not quite a smile. Something older than a smile. I imagine you do. He shifted his glass from one hand to the other, a slow movement, deliberate. "Walter Brennan," he said. I knew the name. Everyone in my world knew the name. 4 stars, Joint Chiefs, 2 wars, the kind of career that gets written about in books that are studied at war colleges, but I kept my face still. "Heidi Graham," I said. He repeated it quietly, the way you repeat something when you're running it against a memory. "Graham." Another pause. "Did you ever serve?" People over 60 know this particular question. It sounds casual. It isn't. It's the kind of question that opens a door and waits to see what walks through. "I did," I said. "Branch?" "Army," he nodded slowly. "Aviation?" The word landed between us with a specific weight. I looked at him for a moment. "Among other things," I said. He was quiet for a while after that. The fountain ran. Somewhere inside, the string quartet had switched to something slower, something in a minor key that drifted out through the glass doors and settled around us like weather. "I ask," he said, "because you're standing out here the way pilots stand. Wait forward. Watching the horizon even when there isn't one." I didn't answer. He wasn't wrong. "I flew for 30 years, he said. "You never quite stop." We stood in a silence that was not uncomfortable. There are people you meet who you can be quiet with immediately, without earning it, and those people are rare enough that when you find one, you pay attention. I was paying attention. Inside, through the glass, I could see Diane moving through the party. She had found a new cluster to hold court with, near the champagne, her hands working that familiar gesturing rhythm. Daniel was still with Marcus's friends. Claire was laughing at something, her hand on Marcus's arm. It was a good party for everyone except possibly me, and even I was managing. "You're the daughter-in-law," Brennan said. "Not a question. 11 years, I said. He made a small sound, something between acknowledgement and understanding. "And how is that?" I looked at him. "Some nights are easier than others. Tonight?" I considered. "The fountain helps." He smiled then, an actual smile. The first one I'd seen from him. It changed his face considerably, made him look like he might, somewhere back in another decade, have been someone who laughed easily. We went back inside a few minutes later. I didn't know what he knew yet. I didn't know what he was turning over in his mind as we walked through those garden doors back into the warmth and light and noise of the Caldwell party. I didn't know that in roughly 40 minutes, the entire composition of that room was going to change. What I did know was that when Diane spotted us walking in from the terrace together, the unremarkable government logistics woman and the silver-haired man in the dark suit, her expression did something I had never seen it do before. It hesitated just for a second, just a flicker. Then the smile came back, smooth and practiced as always. But I had seen it, the hesitation, the recalibration. She didn't know who he was yet either. She was about to find out. It started with a toast. Marcus stood near the fireplace with Claire beside him, his champagne glass raised, his face open and happy in the uncomplicated way of someone who has not yet had to fight for anything. He said the things people say at these moments, about finding the right person, about being lucky, about family meaning everything. Claire's eyes went shiny. A few of the women near the bar pressed hands to their chests. Daniel caught my eye from across the room and gave me a small nod, the private kind, the one that meant I see you and you're doing fine. I raised my glass. I meant it. Then Diane stepped forward. She does this at Caldwell events, inserts herself into the center of moments that are not hers, gently enough that no one can object, firmly enough that everyone understands the room still belongs to her. She added a few words to Marcus's toast, something about legacies and the Caldwell name, and what it meant to welcome the right kind of people into the family. She didn't look at me when she said it. She didn't have to. Patrice looked at me instead, just briefly, just enough. I drank my champagne and looked at the fireplace. Brennan was standing near the far wall with a man I didn't recognize, someone younger, speaking quietly. He had a glass of water again. Still no champagne. I noticed that the younger man was listening with his whole body, squared up, still. The particular attentiveness of someone in the presence of a person whose words carry consequences. Military, I thought, or former. That posture doesn't come from anywhere else. Diane materialized at my side about 10 minutes after the toast. She had the look she got when she had decided something needed to be addressed, a kind of bright, purposeful energy that she dressed up as sociability. "Heidi," she said, "come meet some of Daniel's family. They've been wanting to say hello." I went. Because you go, the family members were 2 aunts and an uncle I had met before at previous events and would likely meet again at future ones. Each of them possessed of the specific incuriosity of people who had already decided what you were and found the category sufficient. They asked how Daniel was as though I might have different information than they did. They asked about the house, about the neighborhood, about whether we'd been traveling. Normal conversation, the kind that asks questions without wanting answers. And then Diane said it. She said it the way she said most things that cut. Lightly, almost offhandedly, as though it had just occurred to her and she was barely paying attention to it herself. She turned to the older of the 2 aunts and said, in that carrying voice of hers, "You know, I always say that Daniel has so many wonderful qualities, but discernment was never quite one of them." A small laugh. The aunt smiled uncertainly. Diane tilted her head at me with that paper-cut smile and said, "You married way down, sweetheart. I mean that with all the love in the world, the room didn't stop. That's the thing about moments like that. The room never stops." The music kept playing, the caterers kept moving. Someone near the bar laughed at something unrelated. The world keeps moving anyway. It always does. I looked at her. I kept my face exactly where I had trained it to stay, which was still and composed and giving away nothing. I said, "I know you do, Diane." And that was all I said. The aunt laughed softly, relieved that it had passed. The uncle looked at his shoes. Diane smiled the smile of someone who had scored a point and was being gracious about it. I became aware. In the peripheral way, you become aware of things when your senses have been sharpened by years of needing them sharp, that someone had entered the room. Not loudly, not with any announcement, but there is a way that certain rooms change when certain people walk into them. A subtle pressure shift, an unconscious reorientation of bodies, the way a compass needle moves when something magnetic comes near. I felt it before I saw it. I turned. Brennan had re-entered from the far end of the main hall. He was no longer in quiet conversation with the younger man. He was moving through the room with the deliberate, unhurried pace of someone who knows exactly where he is going. The crowd parted for him without knowing why. That happens with people who have commanded at the highest levels. It isn't authority performed, it's authority absorbed, built into the way they take up space. He was heading toward me. Diane saw him coming. I watched her assess him the way she assessed all men at these gatherings. The suit, the posture, the age, the invisible signals of rank and money and social position. I saw her recalibrate. Whoever this man was, she understood instinctively that he mattered. She straightened slightly. The smile shifted from paper cut to welcoming. He stopped in front of our small group. He looked at Diane briefly, politely, the way you look at weather. Then he looked at me and Walter Brennan. 4 stars, Joint Chiefs, 2 wars. Took my right hand in both of his, the way you hold something you're being careful with, and he bent and kissed the back of it, not quickly, not as a joke, deliberately, with the full weight of what the gesture meant to people who understood what the gesture meant. Then he straightened, and he said, in that low, unhurried voice, clearly enough for everyone within 10 feet to hear, "Colonel Graham, I was hoping you'd be here tonight." The words landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. I felt the ripple move outward. Deanne's smile didn't disappear. It just stopped working. Her face held the expression without being able to do anything with it, like a clock that shows the right time after the battery has died. The aunt made a small sound. The uncle looked up from his shoes. I looked at Brennan. He was watching me with those steady eyes, and there was something in them. Not triumph, nothing as small as that. Something more like relief. Like a man who had been carrying something a long time and had finally found the right place to set it down. "General Brennan," I said. My voice was level. It has always been level when it mattered most. "I didn't know you'd be here either, small world." He said, smaller than people think. He still had my hand. Deanne found her voice somewhere. "You, too? You know each other?" Brennan turned to look at her then. A long, measured look. The kind that doesn't need to be unkind to be devastating. "I know Colonel Graham," he said. "The way you know someone who brought your people home." The string quartet stopped tween songs at exactly that moment. I don't know if anyone else noticed the timing. I noticed it. 26 years of situational awareness don't turn off because you're standing in a McLean living room with champagne in your hand. The silence lasted maybe 4 seconds. Just the sound of the fountain outside, faint through the glass, and the soft settling of the house around us. And then the musicians found the next piece and the room breathed again. But those 4 seconds had done their work. Deanne's hand tightened around her champagne flute. The 2 aunts had gone very still in the particular way of people who understand that something significant is happening and are not sure yet whether they should pretend it isn't. The uncle had stopped looking at his shoes entirely. Daniel had heard. I knew because I could feel him crossing the room before I saw him. 11 years of marriage gives you that, a kind of peripheral awareness of another person, the ability to track them without looking. He appeared at my shoulder, and I felt his hand find my elbow, light and careful, the way you steady something you love. "What did I miss?" he said quietly. He was asking me, not his mother. I looked at him. General Brennan was just saying hello. Daniel looked at Brennan then, and I watched my husband do the same math everyone in the room was doing. The 4 stars, the posture, the hand kiss, the word colonel, and I watched the number he arrived at change his face in a way I had never seen before. Not shock exactly, something quieter than shock. Something more like the feeling of a door opening onto a room you didn't know was there. Brennan extended his hand to Daniel. "Your wife," he said, "is one of the finest officers I have encountered in 50 years of service. You should know that if you don't already." Daniel shook his hand. He said, "I'm starting to understand that I didn't know nearly enough." His voice was even, but I heard what was underneath it. I would hear it again later that night, at home, when the house was quiet, and we sat at the kitchen table, and he asked me questions I had been waiting 11 years for him to be ready to ask. But that was later. Right now, There was still this room. Brennan turned back to me, and the social geometry of the gathering had quietly reorganized itself. People had drifted closer without appearing to, the way crowds do around something they can feel but can't quite explain. I saw faces I recognized from earlier in the evening. The finance cousin, the Georgetown aunt, Patrice, and all of them had the same expression, which was the expression of people revising a document they thought was finished. "I'd like to tell them," Brennan said to me. Quietly, just between us. "If you'll let me." I looked at him for a moment. 26 years I had kept this in the register of things that didn't need to be said. Private history, internal accounting, the kind of record you keep for yourself because no one else needs to audit it. But Diane was standing 4 feet away with her paper-cut smile finally, fully dissolved. And Daniel was beside me with questions written all over his face. And I was 48 years old and tired. Not the regular tired. Not the tired of a long party, but the tired that comes from carrying something in silence long past the point where silence serves any purpose. "All right," I said. Brennan set his water glass on a passing tray and turned to the room with the ease of a man who had addressed far more difficult audiences. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The room came to him. He talked about Iraq first. 2004, the Western Corridor, a period when the air war was being held together with logistics that didn't work and willpower that shouldn't have had to compensate. He talked about the particular hell of medevac operations in that terrain. The heat, the distances, the ground fire, the math of fuel versus time versus the number of men waiting. He spoke plainly, without drama, the way soldiers speak about hard things, stating facts, letting the facts carry their own weight. He talked about a commander who ran her birds past the point of protocol because protocol had been designed for conditions that no longer existed. Who made decisions in the air that couldn't be radioed up the chain because there wasn't time, and who turned out to be right often enough that her superiors learned to let her make them. Who never asked her crews to take a risk she hadn't already calculated herself. Who, on the worst night of a very bad year, flew 3 sorties when regulations called for 1 in a bird that should have been ground dead after the second. He didn't say my name. He didn't need to. Everyone in the room was looking at me. People over 60. People who have lived long enough to know what the military asks of people who serve. Those people understood what Brennan was describing. I could see it in the faces of the older guests, the ones who had husbands or fathers or sons who had served. Something shifted in them, the way light shifts when a cloud moves. Recognition. The specific gravity of understanding what a thing actually cost. On the night in question, Brennan said, and his voice dropped just slightly, there were 31 men who came home because of decisions made by one pilot in one aircraft with a call sign I will never forget as long as I live. The room was completely quiet now. Even the string quartet had stilled again, either by coincidence or by the instinct musicians sometimes have for the right moment. "Angel 7, Brennan said. "I heard Diane make a sound. Not a word, just a sound. The sound of a person setting something down." Brennan looked at me. "You were Angel 7, I held his gaze. My voice, when it came, was level. It has always been level when it mattered. I was what was left, I said. After the other 6, the room didn't understand that yet. They would. But not tonight, and not from me. What they understood right now was enough. I watched it move across the faces nearest to me, the revision, the recalculation, the quiet collapse of the assumption that had furnished this room's understanding of me for 11 years. The government logistics woman. The wrong choice. Way down, Daniel's hand moved from my elbow to my hand. He held it the way Brennan had, both of his around mine, careful, like something he intended to keep. And Diane Caldwell stood very still in her deep blue dress and her pearls, champagne flute at her side now, and looked at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before. It was the expression of someone who has been wrong for a very long time and has just, in front of everyone, run out of room to be wrong in. We didn't stay much longer after that. Not because the room was hostile. It wasn't. Not anymore. If anything, it had gone too far in the other direction. That particular overcorrection that happens when people realize they have misjudged something badly and compensate with warmth they should have offered from the beginning. The finance cousin wanted to shake my hand. The Georgetown aunt said she had always sensed something remarkable about me, which was not true, but which I accepted graciously because grace costs nothing, and I had enough of it left in reserve for one more evening. Brennan found me before we left. He was standing near the foyer, coat already on, the younger man from earlier waiting a discreet distance behind him. "There's something else," he said, quietly. Just to me, I looked at him. I had known, somewhere in the back of my mind, since he walked back through those garden doors, there is always something else. In my experience, the stories that get told in rooms like this one are the clean versions, the versions that can be absorbed in a single evening by people who were not there. The real versions are longer and heavier and require more than champagne and candlelight to carry. "I know," I said. He studied me for a moment. "Have you ever talked about the report?" 3 words. The report. 11 years, and no one outside a very small circle had ever said those 2 words to me in that particular combination. I felt something move in my chest. Not pain exactly. The memory of pain, which is different. Duller, but wider. "No," I said, "it's time," he said. Not unkindly. The way a doctor tells you something you already know. He handed me a card. Plain, white, a phone number, and nothing else. "Call me this week," he said. "There are people who need to hear what actually happened. And there are people who have been waiting a long time to say what they know." I put the card in my coat pocket. I thanked him. He shook his head slightly. The way you shake your head at thanks you don't feel you've earned. Then he put his coat on the rest of the way and walked out the front door. And the younger man followed, and the house was slightly quieter for his absence. Daniel was waiting by the car. He held the door for me, and when I got in and he came around to the driver's side and sat down and put the key in the ignition, he didn't start the car. He sat there for a moment with his hands on the wheel, looking at the dark driveway, the leaves moving in the headlights of a car leaving ahead of us. "How much don't I know?" he said. I looked at his profile in the dark. Good face. Honest face. The face of a man who had never once tried to make me smaller, which is rarer than it sounds. "Enough," I said. "But I want to tell you." He nodded. He started the car. We drove home through the October dark, and I talked for most of it. Not everything. Some things need a kitchen table and no clock, and the particular courage that daylight doesn't always provide. But I told him the shape of it. The years, the deployments, the birds, the night. Angel 7. What the call sign meant. What the number 7 was counting from. He didn't interrupt. He drove and he listened, and once at a stoplight, he reached over and put his hand on mine on the seat between us and left it there. He didn't take it back. We sat at the kitchen table until past 1 in the morning. And that is when I told him about the report. It had been filed in the spring of 2005, 6 months after the night in question. An internal review, the kind that happens when an operation goes wrong enough that someone above the cloud line needs to explain it in writing. 6 aircraft lost in a single engagement. 17 crew members. Numbers that required accounting. The report had needed someone to be wrong. That is the truth of these things that people outside of uniform don't always understand. Reports like that are not purely fact-finding exercises. They are also sometimes document management exercises. Someone has to carry the weight so the weight doesn't land on a structure that can't bear it. A career, a command, a program with congressional funding attached. The weight gets moved to somewhere it can be absorbed without causing larger damage. The weight had been moved to me. The official finding was not a court-martial. It never went that far, partly because the evidence was too complicated, and partly because certain people intervened at levels I didn't have access to. But it was a mark, a notation, a finding of poor judgment that sat in my file like a stone, not large enough to end things, but heavy enough to be felt every time something was considered, assessed, decided. What the report did not say was that the order sending those 6 aircraft into that corridor at that time had come from above me. What it did not say was that I had objected in writing, through proper channels, 40 minutes before the order was executed. What it did not say was that my objection had been overruled by a colonel whose name I knew and whose career had continued to flourish while mine had accommodated the weight of that stone. What it also did not say was why I had not fought harder. I had not fought harder because that colonel's executive officer, his second, was the husband of a woman I had flown with for 3 years. A good woman, a careful pilot. She had 2 daughters, 7 and 4. And the executive officer, the husband, the father of those girls, had been the one who carried the overruling order to me on the ground that night. He had been following instructions. He had not known what those instructions would cost. If I had pressed the inquiry, his name would have entered the record. His career would have ended. Those 2 little girls would have grown up with a father whose service was defined by one night he spent carrying a message he didn't write. I had decided that was not a cost I was willing to make someone else pay. Daniel sat very still when I finished. "Does anyone know?" he said. "About the objection, the written objection." "Brennan knows," I said. "He's known for a while, and the colonel who gave the order." I looked at my hands on the table. "He retired as a brigadier general," I said. "About 4 years ago." Daniel was quiet for a long time. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a car passed on the street, headlights sliding across the kitchen wall. "The girls," he said finally. "The executive officer's daughters." I looked at him. "The older one," he said slowly. "The one at Virginia Tech. The one we've been helping with tuition." I held his gaze and said nothing. His eyes closed briefly. "When they opened, they were very bright, Heidi," he said. "Just my name. The way you say something, when words are not large enough for what you mean." I didn't sleep much that night. Not because of Diane, not because of the party, not even because of the card in my coat pocket. I lay in the dark next to Daniel and listened to the house settle around us. The tick of the radiator, the wind moving through the oak tree outside our window, the occasional sound of a car on the street, and I thought about a night in October 2004 when the sky over western Iraq was the particular shade of black that comes after flares have burned out, and before dawn has started, and 6 aircraft that should have turned back didn't, and one that should have been grounded flew anyway. I thought about what it costs to carry something for 20 years. Not the weight of it. I had stopped measuring that a long time ago. The weight becomes ordinary after enough time. You stop noticing it the way you stop noticing a scar. What I thought about that night was the shape of it. The specific shape of a decision made in a corridor of terrible options, where every door leads somewhere bad, and you're just trying to choose the door that leads somewhere least bad for the most people. People over 60 understand this. Not the military version necessarily, but the shape of it. You've lived long enough to have made decisions in corridors like that. A parent's ilsna, a marriage, a child in trouble, a job that asks something of you that you weren't sure you should give. The math that doesn't come out clean, no matter how many times you run it. I called Brennan the next morning. He answered on the second ring, which told me he had been waiting. We spoke for 40 minutes. He told me what he knew, which was more than I had expected, and confirmed what I had suspected, which was that the record had never been as sealed as the people who sealed it believed. Documents have a way of surviving. People who know things have a way of still knowing them, even years later, even after they've been told to forget. There had been a congressional inquiry, he told me. Low-level, quiet, the kind that doesn't make the news because it isn't designed to make the news. It had been initiated the previous year by a senator from Virginia whose chief of staff was a former Army JAG officer who had, at some point in his career, come across the notation in my file and found it worth examining. The inquiry was still open. Brennan had been asked to provide a statement. He had been looking for me. I should have looked harder, he said. You found me, I said. He was quiet for a moment. There's a hearing, he said. In 3 weeks. Closed session, Senate Armed Services Subcommittee. They want your testimony. I stood in the kitchen in the morning light with my coffee going cold on the counter, and I looked at the backyard through the window. There was a cardinal on the fence, the sharp red of him against the gray October yard. He was just sitting there, not doing anything in particular, just existing very brightly in a dull-colored world. Will it change anything? I said. For the record? Yes, Brennan said. For you, officially? Probably. The notation. The finding. The people who deserve the weight carrying it instead of you. A pause. For the families of the 17? I think so. Yes. I thought about the 17. I always thought about the 17. In the way that people who survive things always think about the ones who didn't. Not obsessively, not anymore, but with a kind of permanent background hum, like a frequency you've stopped hearing as sound and just feel in your bones. All right, I said. I'll testify. I told Daniel that evening. He sat across the kitchen table and listened, and then he said he wanted to come to Washington with me for the hearing, which I had expected him to offer, and I told him I'd think about it, which was my way of saying yes, without saying it out loud before I was ready. What I didn't expect was what happened the following week. I was at the grocery store on a Tuesday afternoon. The ordinary kind of Tuesday. Nothing particular about it, just an afternoon with a list and a cart and the fluorescent lights of a giant off-Route 7, when my phone rang. Number I didn't recognize. Virginia area code. The voice on the other end was young, female. A little careful, like someone who had rehearsed what she was going to say and was trying to remember the order. Is this Heidi Graham? She said. It is, I said. My name is Brianna Mercer, she said. My father was Captain James Mercer. He was the executive officer under Colonel Dayton in Iraq. He passed away 3 years ago. A brief pause. I think you knew him. I stopped in the middle of the cereal aisle. A woman with a stroller moved around me and I didn't notice. I knew him, I said. I found out recently, she said, and her voice had the particular quality of someone being very careful to keep it level, about the tuition payments. My mother told me when I asked why my aid package had always been different from what the financial office projected. She'd known for a while. She made me promise not to contact you until I graduated. Another pause. I graduated in May. I leaned against the shelving. Cornflakes on one side, granola on the other. Fluorescent lights overhead, the sound of a shopping cart somewhere down the aisle. I'm glad you graduated, I said. Why did you do it? She said. After everything, after what happened, why would you do that for us? I thought about how to answer that. There are questions that deserve real answers, not the trimmed-down version, not the version that fits in polite conversation. This was one of them. Your father, I said, was given an order he didn't write, on a night that went wrong in ways that had nothing to do with him. He did his job. He was a good officer and a good man, and the night cost him more than it cost me, because he had to live with it too. I paused. What happened to those 17 men wasn't his fault. It wasn't mine either. But someone had to carry it, and I decided it wasn't going to be his daughter's. The line was quiet for a moment. Then Brianna Mercer said, in a voice that had stopped being careful and was just itself now, I want to testify. At the hearing. I want to tell them what my father wrote in his journal about that night. I closed my eyes in the cereal aisle of a grocery store in Northern Virginia on a Tuesday afternoon. He kept a journal? I said. He kept everything, she said. He was that kind of man. The hearing was on a Thursday in early November. Washington in November has a specific quality that I have always found clarifying. The trees stripped down, the light low and direct, no softness left in anything. The city showing instruments. I have always trusted cities more when you can see their bones. It tells you what they're actually made of. Daniel drove. We didn't talk much on the way in. He had learned over the years to read when I needed quiet and when I needed conversation, and that morning he understood it was quiet. He had the radio off. He took the long way across the bridge because the river was beautiful in that light, gray-green and moving, and he knew I liked moving water. The subcommittee room was smaller than people imagine these things to be. A long table, wood-paneled walls, the flags of the service branches arranged behind the dais, the kind of lighting that makes everyone look slightly older than they are. There were 6 senators present, 2 of their chiefs of staff, a court reporter, a JAG officer from the army who I recognized by the cut of her uniform before I saw her face. She gave me a small nod when I came in. I returned it. Brennan was already there, seated to one side, in his dress uniform, 4 stars, the full weight of 50 years on his chest in metal and ribbon. He stood when I entered, which he did not have to do, and the gesture landed in the room with the quiet force of everything it meant. Brianna Mercer was there too. I had not seen her before that morning, only spoken to her twice by phone since the cereal aisle on a Tuesday in October. She was 23 years old, dark-haired, with her father's particular quality of stillness, that way of sitting that suggests the person is always listening harder than they appear to be. She was in a navy blazer. She had a manila folder on the table in front of her that I knew contained her father's journal entries from the fall of 2004. When she saw me, she stood up. She walked across the room and she held out her hand and I shook it, and she looked at me the way her father had looked at me once, across a flight line in the western desert the morning after a very long night, directly, with the full measure of what she understood. And she said, "Thank you for coming. Thank you for being here," I said. We sat down. I will not reconstruct the full testimony here. Some of it is in the record now, which is where it belongs. And the record can speak for itself more precisely than memory can. What I can tell you is what it felt like to say the things I had not said for 20 years in a room with federal authority and a court reporter taking it all down in real time. It felt like setting something on the floor after carrying it up a very long staircase, not relief exactly. Something more structural than relief. The particular sensation of a weight redistributing, finding its proper place, being held by the architecture that was designed to hold it rather than by the one person who had been substituting for that architecture for 2 decades because the architecture had failed. I told them about the objection. I had a copy of it. Brennan had located it in records that technically should not have still existed, filed under a document series that had been scheduled for destruction, but hadn't quite made it there yet, which is the kind of bureaucratic accident that occasionally serves justice. I read the date and time of the objection into the record. I named the officer who overruled it. I described the corridor we had been ordered into, the conditions, the aircraft status, the math I had done at altitude in the dark, and the math I had communicated to command before the order came down. I said the names of the 17, all of them, into the record, because records should have names in them, not just numbers and findings and notations, and those men deserved to be named in the place where the truth about the night they died was finally being told. When I finished, one of the senators, a woman from Georgia, older, white-haired, who had the composed and watchful face of someone who has heard many things in many rooms and is not easily moved, looked at me for a moment before she asked her first question. She said, "Colonel Graham, why did you wait?" I looked at her. "I wasn't waiting," I said. "I was deciding what the silence cost and whether it was still worth paying." She considered that. "And now?" "Now," I said. "There's a young woman at this table whose father kept a journal, and she came here voluntarily to tell you what he wrote. That changes the math." Brianna testified after me. She read from the journal in a steady voice, the voice of someone who had practiced steadiness for this moment and earned it. Her father's handwriting, she told us, was very small and very precise, the way pilots write when they're used to making notes in logbooks. He had written about the order, about his own doubts, about the woman he'd watched fly 3 sorties in a bird that shouldn't have been airborne. He had written, "She argued for our lives before they sent us in, and she flew for our lives after they sent us in anyway, and I don't know how a person carries that." The room was very quiet when she finished. Brennan testified last. He spoke for 22 minutes. He was precise and unhurried and devastating in the specific way that credibility is devastating. No drama, just the weight of a 50-year career bearing down on a documented record of institutional failure. He named the officer who had written the findings against me. He named the officer who had given the order. He placed both names in the context of their subsequent careers, their promotions, their decorations, and then he placed my name in the context of mine, and he let the comparison do what comparisons do when the facts are simply stated and nothing is embellished. When it was over, we stood in the hallway outside the hearing room while aides and staffers moved past us with the purposeful energy of people with other rooms to get to. Brennan shook my hand. Brianna hugged me briefly, which surprised me, and which I returned before I had time to think about whether I would. Daniel was waiting in the corridor by the elevator. He had not been permitted in the closed session. He had sat on a bench in the hallway for 3 hours with a cup of cold coffee and a book he had not read. When he saw me come through the door, he stood up and looked at my face and said nothing, just opened his arms. And I walked into them and stood there for a moment in the bone-cold light of a November morning in Washington and let myself be held, somewhere across town, in an office building near Foggy Bottom. A retired brigadier general was, according to Brennan, already consulting a lawyer, and somewhere in McLean, Virginia, I knew without knowing for certain, Diane Caldwell was sitting with a piece of information she had not had 2 weeks ago, one that was going to require her to rebuild something from the foundation up. The letter from the subcommittee came 6 weeks later. It was a Tuesday, which seems to be the day things happened to me. Ordinary Tuesdays. Nothing particular about them, just the middle of the week going about its business. Daniel brought it in from the mailbox with the electric bill and a catalog for a garden supply company we had never ordered from, and set it on the kitchen table in front of me without saying anything. The return address was a Senate office building on Constitution Avenue. I made myself finish my coffee before I opened it. The finding against me had been vacated, the notation removed from my file. The subcommittee's report, still classified but formally entered into the record, attributed the loss of the 6 aircraft and their crews to a command decision made above my level, over my documented objection, in conditions I had accurately assessed and correctly predicted. The language was careful and governmental and bloodless. The way language in official documents is when it is trying to say something true without sounding emotional about it. But the meaning was plain. I had been right. The record now said so. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time after I read it. The cardinal was on the fence again. Or a cardinal, anyway. I had decided some time ago to treat it as the same one, which may not be ornithologically accurate but felt true in the way that some things feel true regardless of evidence. He sat on the fence post in the December light, very red against the gray sky, not doing anything in particular. Daniel came in from the back of the house and saw my face. He sat down across from me and I slid the letter across the table to him, and he read it. And then he looked up, and his eyes were very bright, and he said, "Heidi." Just my name again. Still enough, Diane called that afternoon. I had not spoken to her since the party. Daniel had spoken to her once, briefly the week after, a conversation he described as short and charged and unresolved. She had not called me directly since Marcus's rehearsal dinner 2 years ago, when she had called to suggest I wear something more formal than what she imagined I would choose, which was its own particular kind of message. I let it ring. Then I picked up. She was quiet for a moment after I said hello. I could hear her breathing, which was the breathing of someone who has prepared what they want to say and is now, at the moment of saying it, uncertain whether the preparation was sufficient. "I owe you an apology," she said. I didn't help her along. I have learned that apologies need to find their own footing, and that the impulse to smooth them over is often more about the listener's comfort than the speaker's honesty. "I have said things," she said over the years, in front of people. And I said them with the assumption that I understood what you were and what you weren't, and I was wrong, and I said them in ways that were unkind. More than unkind, a pause. "I didn't know." "No," I said. "You didn't. Another silence. I don't think it excuses it, she said, not knowing. I'm not saying that as an excuse. I looked out the kitchen window at the December yard. The cardinal had gone. The fence post was empty. I know, I said. I think, she said. And her voice had changed slightly, gone quieter, lost the careful preparation, and become something more like the actual person underneath the preparation. I think I was afraid of you. I don't know when it started, but you never needed anything from me, from any of us. And I didn't understand that, and I made it mean something wrong. I thought about that for a moment. It was the most honest thing Diane Caldwell had ever said to me in 11 years. It was also, underneath the honesty, the truest thing she could have said. People don't demean what they're indifferent to. They demean what unsettles them, what they can't account for, what doesn't fit the story they've told themselves about how the world is ordered. Daniel loves you, I said. He's always loved you. That doesn't change. She made a sound that might have been a laugh, or might have been something else. He's a better person than I deserve, she said. He got that from his father. He got some of it from you, I said. Whether you know it or not. She was quiet again. Then she said, could I take you to lunch? Sometime, when you're ready. No agenda. I'd like to try. I thought about long-time horizons. About the cost of holding things versus the cost of putting them down. About the cardinal on the fence post and the fact that I had decided, for reasons I couldn't entirely justify, to believe it was the same one every time. Yes, I said. When I'm ready, we had lunch in January. A small place in Falls Church, the kind of restaurant with paper menus and good soup and no pretension. Diane arrived first, which told me something. She was wearing a simple coat, no pearls. She stood when I came in. That told me something, too. We talked for 2 hours. Not about the party, not about the hearing, not about the 17 or Angel 7 or General Brennan or any of the architecture of what had happened. We talked about Daniel, about Marcus and Claire, about her late husband, who had been a quieter and gentler man than she had been a wife to him, which was something she said plainly and without performing remorse. We talked about what it felt like to be in your 60s and revising the story you'd told about yourself for 30 years. I told her it was probably easier than she expected. Once she started, she said she wasn't sure about that. I said neither was I. When we left, she held the door for me. I drove home through Falls Church in the January light and thought about a word for what the afternoon had been. Not forgiveness exactly. Forgiveness is a larger transaction and it takes longer to settle. Not friendship. Something more preliminary than either. The first honest conversation. The ground cleared for something that might eventually be built on it if both parties kept showing up. That seemed like enough for January. That evening, Brianna Mercer emailed to say that a publisher had reached out about her father's journals. She wanted to know how I felt about it. I wrote back and told her the truth belonged to her family and that her father's words deserved to be in the world. 2 days later, a certified letter arrived from a law firm representing the retired brigadier general. His legal team, it informed me, had no objection to the subcommittee's findings and wished to resolve the matter without further proceeding. I set the letter on the kitchen table next to Daniel's coffee mug. Is that what resolution feels like? Daniel said. I think so, I said. I'll let you know when I've had more time with it. A year later, almost to the day, I was standing in the backyard raking leaves when Daniel came out with 2 cups of coffee and sat on the back steps and watched me work. It was a Saturday in late October, cold and clear, the kind of day that smells like wood smoke and dry grass and the particular sweetness of leaves that have been on the ground long enough to start going back to earth. The oak tree had shed most of itself overnight. There were leaves everywhere, copper and brown, and the occasional stubborn yellow, deep enough in places to hide the grass entirely. I raked for a while, and Daniel drank his coffee, and we didn't need to talk. That is still one of my favorite things about him. The man understands silence. After a while he said, "Do you feel different?" I thought about it. I kept raking. Some, I said, good different or just different. I leaned on the rake handle and looked at the yard. The cardinal was on the fence. He had been on the fence most mornings that fall, or the one I had decided was him, which amounted to the same thing. Very red, very certain of himself. Just existing in the world without apology. Good different, I said. Mostly. The year had moved through its seasons the way years do after something large has shifted. Not smoothly, not without difficulty, but with the sense of ground that is more solid than it was before. The subcommittee report had been picked up quietly by 2 military affairs journalists, and less quietly by one national outlet that ran a piece in the spring under a headline I found accurate but slightly dramatic. My phone had rung for 2 weeks afterward, which I managed by mostly not answering it. Brennan had called once to say the piece had circulated inside the Pentagon and that certain conversations were happening in certain offices, which I understood to mean that the institutional reckoning was proceeding at the pace institutions reckon at, which is slow but not nothing. The retired brigadier general had settled. The details were not public, and I did not discuss them. What I can say is that the families of 3 of the 17 received something formal from the Army that they had not received before, acknowledging what their sons and husbands and fathers had done and what had been done to the accounting of how they died. I know because one of the families wrote to me, a mother from Beaufort, South Carolina, 81 years old, whose son Marcus, not Daniel's brother Marcus, another Marcus entirely, a 24-year-old crew chief from a town near the coast, had been on the 3rd aircraft. She wrote in a large, careful hand on pale blue stationery, and she said that she had always known her boy died doing something right, and now the paper said so too, and that was what she had needed. I wrote back, "We have exchanged 4 letters since then." She sends me photographs sometimes. Marcus in his dress uniform. Marcus at his high school graduation. Marcus at what she says was his favorite fishing spot on the Beaufort River, squinting into the sun with a rod in his hand and a look on his face like the afternoon had gone exactly the way an afternoon should. I keep the photographs in an envelope in my nightstand. I take them out sometimes. I think about the fishing spot and the afternoon and the way the light probably looked on that river. And I think about the number 7 and what it was counting from. And I sit with all of it the way you sit with things that are heavy and true and yours to carry. Brianna Mercer's book came out in September. Her father's journals, edited and annotated by Brianna herself, with a foreword by a historian of military operations whose work I had read and respected. She sent me an advance copy with a note tucked inside the front cover. The note said, "He wrote about you more than once. I think he would have wanted you to know he understood." I read it on the back porch on an evening in August with the cicadas going in the trees, that high, insistent sound that means the summer is already turning towards something else, and I sat with it until the light was gone. Deanne came to Thanksgiving. She had been to the house before, of course, many times over the years. But this time she came the way you come somewhere, when you're no longer performing your right to be there. She brought a sweet potato casserole she had made herself, which Daniel told me later was the first time in his memory she had arrived at anyone's house with something she had cooked with her own hands. She sat at the kitchen table while I finished the turkey, and we talked about ordinary things. And she asked questions that were actually questions, the kind that want answers. And she listened to the answers, and at some point in the late afternoon, while Daniel and Marcus were doing something with football in the living room, she looked at me across the kitchen and said, simply, "I'm glad you're in this family." I looked at her. "I've always been in this family," I said. She smiled. "A real one, nothing paper about it." "I know," she said. "I'm glad I can see it now. That is, I think, the most any of us can ask of each other. Not to be right from the beginning, just to be willing, eventually, to see." I went back to the leaves. The rake pulled them into long rows, and the air smelled like October, and Daniel poured the rest of his coffee into the grass and came to help me, working the far side of the yard with a second rake he had retrieved from the garage. We worked in easy parallel. the way people work when they know each other's rhythms, and the pile in the center of the yard grew. And the cardinal watched us from the fence without comment. There is a thing about Angel 7 that I have never explained to anyone who wasn't there, not fully. The call sign started as a designation, the 7th aircraft in a rotation, the one still airborne when the others weren't. It became something else over time, the way things do when they survive something they had no reasonable right to survive. The crews who flew with me afterward shortened it. They stopped saying Angel 7 as a designation and started saying it as a name, the way you say the name of something you trust. She's coming. Angel 7 is on approach. Wait for Angel 7. Like the number was a promise. Like being the one still flying was itself a kind of answer to everything that had come before. I didn't choose the call sign. Nobody chooses the thing that defines them. You just keep flying in whatever corridor you're given, with whatever aircraft you have left. You make the best decisions you can in the dark. You bring home who you can bring home. And if you're lucky, if you're very lucky, you land in a backyard on an October morning with wood smoke in the air and a man raking leaves beside you and a cardinal on the fence who has decided, for reasons of his own, to stay. That is what the 7 was counting from. Everything that didn't make it, I was what was left. And I have decided, for a long time now, that being what is left is enough. More than enough. It is, in fact, everything. If this story found you today, if something in it touched a part of you that needed touching, share it with someone who deserves to hear it. We all know someone who has been carrying something in silence. We all know someone who has been seen wrong for too long. Tell them Angel 7 is still flying.